Chapter 1. The Shadowed Visitor of Baker Street. It was in the raw, grey morning of a bleak November that I once more found myself seated by the hearth of our rooms in Baker Street, observing my remarkable companion with the mingled admiration and bewilderment that never failed to seize me whenever I contemplated his peculiar habits. The fog that rolled from the Thames had crept into the very heart of the city, coiling about lamp-posts and muffling the rattle of distant hansom cabs. The window panes were beaded with moisture, and the murky light that filtered through them gave our sitting room the sombre hue of a sepulchre. Holmes was in one of his introspective moods. He reclined in his armchair, long limbs drawn together, his piercing eyes half shuttered, his fingers pressed together beneath the sharp angle of his chin. A single tendril of smoke rose from his pipe, curling like a ghost through the dim air. Upon the table before him lay a scatter of papers, clippings from various journals, a chemical retort, and a small brass key of curious make. "You are unusually quiet this morning, Holmes," said I, breaking the silence. "Is it the weather that weighs upon you, or the absence of a case worthy of your faculties?" He did not stir. "Neither, my dear Watson," said he at last. "I am engaged upon an experiment of an altogether different nature, that of silence. You would be astonished how much can be learned by the mere act of listening to the city breathe." I smiled. "And what does the city whisper to you this morning?" "That it hides something," he murmured. "Something old and secret, and not meant for the ears of men." Before I could press him further, a sharp rapping sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson, ever patient despite our eccentricities, entered a moment later bearing a card upon a silver tray. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. He says the matter is urgent, sir. Urgent enough that he's come all the way from the docks." Holmes's eyes brightened. "From the docks? Then we shall not keep him waiting. Show him in, Mrs. Hudson." A few moments later our visitor entered. He was a man of middle years, roughened by wind and sea, his complexion bronzed and his hands marked by old scars. His coat was sodden with fog, and his hat clutched nervously in his fingers. Yet despite his rugged aspect, there was something in his bearing, an air of discipline and gravity, which bespoke the naval man. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said he, his voice hoarse and low. "My name is Captain Elias Draycott, late of the merchant vessel Arabella. I have come to you, sir, because there is a matter at the docks police that no one can make sense of. They said, if anyone could, it would be you." Holmes inclined his head. "Pray, take a seat, Captain Draycott. You may speak freely before my friend, Dr. Watson. I can assure you that anything you say will be treated in the strictest confidence." The captain seated himself heavily, his eyes darting once toward the fog-dulled window before he began. "It was last night, sir, near midnight. My ship, the Arabella, had been in dock 3 days, unloading machinery bound for the continent. I was lodging at the old iron Crypt warehouse down by the West India docks. You may know the place. It was once a bonded storehouse, and the lower cellars were built of iron plates and stone, like a vault. The dockmen call it the Crypt, because no sound carries from below once the great doors are sealed." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "I know it. An antiquated and rather grim structure." "Just so. Well, sir, I had retired early, but near the middle watch I was awakened by a sound I can only describe as a whisper, faint, metallic, and inhuman. It came from the lower level, the iron cellars beneath the warehouse. I took my lamp and went down, thinking perhaps some rat or loose chain had made the noise. But as I reached the bottom stair, I found the door to the lower vault open, though I had locked it myself but an hour before." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And what did you see, Captain?" The man's face went pale beneath its tan. "Nothing that I could swear to. The air was thick and cold as a grave, and my lamp flickered so that the shadows seemed alive. I thought I heard that whisper again, nearer this time. And then, by heaven, something moved in the dark. I turned and fled. When I came back with a constable not 20 minutes later, the vault was shut and locked as before. But inside—" He stopped and swallowed hard. Holmes's voice was quiet, but it carried. "Inside?" "There was a man, sir, a dockhand named Barlow, lying dead upon the floor. No sign of violence, no wound or mark upon him. His face, forgive me, was twisted as though he had died in terror. The constable swears no one entered or left that place while he stood guard. And yet, that whispering sound, it came again, faint and cold, while we stood there. Even the constable heard it. Holmes rose and crossed to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "A dead man in a locked iron cellar," he murmured. "A whisper no man can explain. And this occurred in a warehouse whose very walls are designed to muffle sound. Curious, most curious." Watson could not help but interject. "You have had the body examined, of course?" "Yes, doctor," said Draycott. "The police surgeon found nothing, no poison, no blow, no sign of struggle. The coroner says heart failure, but I knew Barlow well. He was strong as an ox and not yet 30. Holmes turned from the window, his eyes alight with that strange inner fire that marked the birth of a new problem. "Tell me, Captain, this iron crypt, is it of ordinary construction?" "Far from it, sir. The place was built by an ironworks company 50 years ago for storing machinery under lock and key. The cellars are lined with riveted iron plates, each the thickness of a man's hand. There's no window and only one door, secured with a lock of uncommon complexity. No man could enter or leave without the key, and I had that key in my own pocket." Holmes regarded the small brass key upon our table, the one he had been studying before the captain's arrival. He held it up to the lamplight and smiled thinly. "Then I believe, Watson, that Providence has just presented us with a singular coincidence." "How so, Holmes?" "This key, which came to me by post 2 days ago, purports to belong to a certain iron crypt warehouse. Though it bears no sender's name nor note of explanation, I had thought it a practical jest." "But it would appear," he said, tossing the key lightly in the air and catching it, "that our jest has become a summons." Captain Draycott started from his chair. "Then you will come, Mr. Holmes?" "Indeed. There is a whisper in that iron vault that demands translation, and I have long wished to test the acoustics of that singular building. Watson, fetch your coat. The fog, though disagreeable, will serve us well, for secrets, like shadows, thrive best when the lamps burn low." Thus began the strangest of all the investigations I have ever shared with Sherlock Holmes, an affair of darkness and steel, of whispering vaults and death without violence. Little did I know, as I followed my friend out into the London fog that morning, that the sound I would come to hear within that iron crypt would haunt my dreams for many years thereafter. Chapter 2. The Iron Crypt. The fog hung thick about the river that morning, curling in slow, ghostly eddies as our hansom made its laborious way eastward. The driver's whip cracked vainly over the horse's steaming flanks, while the wheels clattered upon the wet cobbles like the rattle of distant musketry. I had accompanied Holmes on countless errands into London's darker quarters, but seldom had I felt a gloom so oppressive as that which seemed to press upon the Thames side that day. Holmes sat beside me, silent and withdrawn. His keen grey eyes gazed through the fog as though it were but a veil through which his reason could easily pierce. Once or twice he muttered a phrase beneath his breath, fragments such as sound transference, reverberation, and temperature differential. I knew better than to interrupt him when he fell into such reveries. His mind, once fixed upon a thread, spun its web in silence until the pattern stood complete. At length the cab drew up before a cluster of low warehouses looming out of the fog like the hulks of stranded ships. A tall, grim figure awaited us under a flickering gas lamp. It was Inspector Tobias Gregson of Scotland Yard, square-jawed, sandy-haired, and with that air of pragmatic competence which so often rendered him useful to Holmes. "Morning, Mr. Holmes," said Gregson, touching his hat. "Didn't expect you out so soon. Captain Draycott told us you might be interested. A queer business, this one." Holmes dismounted lightly. "So I gather. The constable's report mentioned the name Iron Crypt Warehouse?" Gregson nodded. "That's the place. Belongs to a shipping company now. Dockfield and Sons. Been standing near empty this last year, save for a few consignments of machinery from the continent. The body was found in the lower cellar, locked from the inside, as you'll see. We followed Gregson down a narrow lane between the warehouses until the great structure itself came into view, an immense edifice of blackened brick and riveted iron plates, its windows shuttered and barred, its double doors chained and bolted like the entrance to a tomb. The fog clung to its surface as if reluctant to let go. An unlovely place, I remarked. Ugly, yes, said Holmes, but also singular. Do you notice, Watson, how the echo of our footsteps dies almost at once? The iron absorbs sound rather than reflecting it. Unusual in a building of this kind. Inside, the air was colder still. Our footsteps rang hollow upon the metal stairway as Gregson led us down to the lower vault. The lantern light danced across the riveted walls, which were streaked with rust like old blood. The atmosphere was heavy with the odor of oil and salt and something else, something faintly sweet, unpleasantly so, that made me instinctively draw back. Here we are, said Gregson, halting before a massive iron door. This is the only entrance. Locked when we found it, locked now. The key was taken from Captain Draycott, who swears he left it on his own desk that night. No sign of tampering with the lock. Holmes took the key, the same curious brass one that had arrived by post, and compared it to the lock's design. His brows lifted slightly. A perfect match. The cuttings are identical. Remarkable coincidence, Watson. He turned the key. With a creak and a groan, the great door swung inward, releasing a breath of air so chill that our lanterns flickered blue. We stepped within. The vault was vast and low, supported by a forest of iron columns, its ceiling crisscrossed with heavy girders. Crates and machinery lay in ordered stacks, their surfaces coated in dust. At the center of the floor, a chalk outline marked the spot where the unfortunate dockhand had fallen. Holmes knelt beside it, examining the ground with a lens. No struggle, he murmured. No disturbance of dust except for the victim's own footprints, and one other, smaller, narrower, pointed at the toe. A woman's shoe, perhaps. Gregson frowned. A woman? Down here? That's unlikely, Mr. Holmes. The documents swear no female ever set foot in this place. Then someone swears falsely, said Holmes curtly. Watson, do you perceive this faint circular depression near the mark? What do you make of it? I bent low. A ring, perhaps. A small object. Dropped? Precisely, and the edge is darkened, as though of metal that has recently been heated. Curious, extremely curious. He rose and moved toward the wall, tapping at intervals with his stick. Each tap gave forth a dull, muffled thud. But when he reached the farthest corner, a single strike produced a faint, resonant tone that lingered in the air. There! Holmes exclaimed. Do you hear that, Watson? Hollow, as though a chamber lies beyond. Gregson's face grew wary. Impossible. The plans show no passage behind that wall. Holmes smiled faintly. Then the plans are incomplete. Fetch me a crowbar, Inspector. Gently, if you please. While Gregson dispatched a constable, Holmes stood motionless, head slightly inclined, listening. For a long moment there was silence. Then, faint and unmistakable, there came a sound, a whisper, metallic and tremulous, like the breath of wind across a wire. I confess the hair rose upon my neck. The sound had an eerie quality, neither human nor mechanical, but somewhere between. It seemed to circle the vault, fading, returning, and at last dying away altogether. Gregson crossed himself. Good Lord, did you hear that? Holmes's expression did not alter. Yes, and it was not a whisper, Inspector. It was resonance, a vibration traveling through the iron itself. The question is, what caused it? The crowbar was brought, and Holmes directed the constable to lever open a section of the wall at the point of hollow resonance. With a screech of metal, the panel gave way, revealing a narrow cavity scarcely 2 feet deep. Within it lay a tangle of thin copper tubing and a small brass cylinder fitted with a valve. Holmes examined it closely. A crude but ingenious contrivance, he murmured. A resonance chamber designed to carry sound through metal. But for what purpose? And why conceal it here? Gregson looked perplexed. You mean it's some sort of speaking device? Possibly. Or something more subtle. An instrument for deception. He turned the cylinder in his hands. There is a faint scent of ozone. Watson, note that. It suggests electrical activity. Perhaps a galvanic reaction. I would wager this device was recently in operation. Holmes replaced the panel and dusted his hands. Inspector, I must ask that you place a guard upon this building tonight. No one is to enter or leave without my knowledge. Captain Draycott, I would also request that you make no mention of what has been found. There are forces at work here that thrive upon secrecy. Gregson nodded grimly. Very well, Mr. Holmes, but what's your notion of the dead man? You think he saw or heard something that frightened him to death? Holmes gave a thin smile. Frightened? No, shocked perhaps. But by what we have yet to learn, it is often not what a man sees, but what he realizes. That stills the heart. As we emerged once more into the grey daylight, I saw that Holmes's entire manner had altered. The languor of the morning had vanished. Every nerve seemed tuned to a higher pitch. He spoke little as we took our cab back to Baker Street, save to mutter at intervals. A voice through iron, a death without violence, and a key that arrives unbidden. At Baker Street he went directly to his chemical bench, where he laid the brass cylinder upon a cloth, and examined it beneath his lens. Watson, said he presently, you may recall a certain case, the adventure of the engineer's thumb, in which hydraulic power was employed for sinister ends. This, I suspect, is its modern cousin. Someone here has married mechanics to illusion, and with deadly result. He turned the device in his fingers, and for an instant a faint vibration passed through the air, like the low hum of a distant bell. Holmes's eyes narrowed. There, Watson, the whisper again. Do you hear it? I did, soft and shivering like a voice beneath the floor. Holmes smiled faintly. It speaks still, and until I discover its tongue I shall not rest. Chapter 3. The Whispering Device. When I returned to Baker Street the following morning, I found Holmes already deep in his investigations. The room bore the unmistakable air of one of his more intense periods of study, the table strewn with instruments, bottles, scraps of wire, and an alarming number of chemical stains upon the carpet, which I knew would drive poor Mrs. Hudson to despair. A faint hum emanated from a coil of apparatus upon his bench, and the odor of burning insulation hung in the air. Holmes, his dressing gown cast aside for his working coat, stood at the table with that peculiar poise of concentration that seemed to compress his tall frame into a single point of thought. His long, sensitive fingers manipulated a pair of fine electrodes attached to the mysterious brass cylinder we had retrieved from the iron crypt. "Ah, Watson," he said without looking up, "you arrive at the very moment I had hoped. Your timing, my dear fellow, is sometimes nothing short of providential. Kindly close the door. The draught interferes with the vibration." I obeyed, glancing at the device that now occupied the center of our table. The cylinder had been connected by wires to a small induction coil, which in turn led to a galvanic battery. A tuning fork, suspended above, quivered faintly. "What in heaven's name are you doing, Holmes?" I asked. "Listening," he replied simply. "And I would ask that you do the same. Hold this receiver to your ear, gently, and tell me what you perceive." He handed me a small metal tube connected to the cylinder by a flexible wire. I placed it to my ear as directed. For a few moments I heard nothing but a faint electric hum. Then, very softly, so soft that I thought it my imagination, there came a sound like the echo of a human whisper, drawn out and metallic, as though a voice were speaking through. "Water and steel." I started and looked up in astonishment. "Holmes, there are words, or something resembling them." His eyes gleamed. "Precisely, Watson. A resonance transmission device of crude but fascinating construction. Observe." He turned a small lever. The hum rose to a clearer tone, and now I could distinguish certain syllables, blurred and indistinct, yet possessing a rhythm unmistakably human. "Do you hear me?" The words faded into a low hiss. I confess I set the receiver down with a shudder. "Good heavens, Holmes! Is it some species of phonograph? Partly, he said, disconnecting the wires, but far older in conception. This device does not record sound, it transmits it through metal. A primitive cousin to the speaking tube, but of more ingenious design. I have found within it a minute electrical coil, sufficient to produce oscillations when a current is applied. Someone has employed this to project sound through the iron walls of that warehouse, giving rise to this so-called whisper. I frowned. But to what end? Why go to such elaborate lengths merely to create a sound? Holmes's lips curved in that familiar faint smile which was never wholly reassuring. That, my dear Watson, is the heart of the puzzle. Sound, when properly used, can deceive the senses as surely as any illusion of sight. You recall the effects of ventriloquism, the human voice appearing to come from an inanimate object. Imagine that same principle magnified by resonance within a chamber of iron. To the listener, the very walls might seem alive. He lifted the cylinder and held it to the light. Consider the psychological effect, Watson. You are alone in a sealed cellar, the air thick and cold, the walls silent. Then from the iron itself comes a whisper, faint, human, inexplicable. Even the strongest nerves might falter. Then you believe Barlow died of fright. Possibly, or perhaps the fright was merely the instrument of his death. There remains the question of who set this infernal contrivance in motion, and for what purpose. That we must uncover. Holmes moved to his desk and spread out a sheet of notes covered in his angular hand. Observe. The frequency of the vibration corresponds precisely to the natural resonance of the iron plates used in the warehouse construction. Only one familiar with engineering acoustics could have calibrated it so precisely. I have written to an acquaintance at the Royal Institution, a certain Professor Catterick, to inquire whether any recent experiments in sound propagation have been conducted near the docks. There may be a connection. He paused and tapped the brass surface thoughtfully. Also, there is the matter of the smaller footprint found beside the body. A feminine tread, delicate yet confident. It is not the mark of a dock labourer, but of someone accustomed to moving quietly. I mean, to discover her identity. At that moment, a knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a telegram upon a tray. Holmes tore it open and read it swiftly. Ah, just as I hoped. Gregson reports that the inquest on Barlow is concluded. Verdict, death from heart failure induced by shock. The jury, in their wisdom, declined to speculate further. But, he added, eyes glittering, he also notes that a stranger was seen near the iron crypt last night, a woman in a dark travelling cloak. She spoke briefly with the watchman and disappeared toward the river. "By Jove!" I exclaimed, "the very figure you suspect. Indeed, Watson, you will accompany me tonight. We shall pay another visit to our whispering vault, under cover of darkness. Bring your revolver. I fancy this affair may not be without its dangers." That evening found us once more descending the damp stairway to the iron crypt. The fog had thickened until the gas lamps burned like dull red eyes, and the water lapped faintly against the wharf. Gregson had discreetly withdrawn his men at Holmes's request, leaving the warehouse under our observation alone. Holmes carried a small lantern, which he kept shaded. His every movement was cautious, deliberate. We entered the vault in silence. For some minutes all was still. Then Holmes touched my arm. "Listen." Out of the iron darkness came that same whispering hum, faint but distinct. It rose and fell like the murmur of a distant sea. Holmes's eyes flashed. "It is active again," he breathed. "Someone nearby is operating a second transmitter." He moved swiftly toward the far wall and pressed his ear against it. Then, with a gesture for silence, he extinguished the lantern. We stood in utter blackness. My pulse quickened. From beyond the wall came a soft scuff of footsteps, then the metallic click of a key. The door we had entered quivered slightly, and then almost imperceptibly began to move. Holmes's whisper was close to my ear. "Steady, Watson. Whoever enters, let them think the place empty." The door creaked open. A faint glow appeared, the light of another lantern held low. Through the gloom stepped a cloaked figure. slender, cautious, gloved hands steady as she crossed the threshold. I could discern only the faint outline of a veil. She moved directly to the wall where the cylinder had been concealed and knelt, producing a second device from beneath her cloak, a twin to the one Holmes had examined. Holmes's hand tightened on my shoulder. "Now," he said, and the lantern flashed a light. The woman sprang up with a cry. Holmes's voice rang cold and clear. "You will oblige me, madam, by remaining precisely where you stand." For a moment she seemed inclined to flee. Then, seeing that Holmes had placed himself between her and the door, she let the lantern fall from her grasp and sank against the iron wall. Her voice when she spoke was low but firm. "You should not have come here, Mr. Holmes. This place is dangerous. For you as well as for me." Holmes bowed slightly. "You're concerned as you credit, madam, but I must insist upon knowing your purpose. You were about to reactivate this device, the twin of one that has already caused a man's death. Who are you, and what is your connection to the Iron Crypt?" The woman hesitated, then slowly lifted her veil. Even in the dim light I saw that she was strikingly beautiful, pale, dark-eyed, with that peculiar mixture of intelligence and weariness that speaks of both courage and misfortune. "My name," she said quietly, "is Elena Veris. I came here not to kill, but to prevent another death. The whisper you have heard is not meant for the living, Mr. Holmes. It was designed to awaken the dead." Her words, uttered there amid the echoing iron shadows, struck me with a chill unlike any I had known. Holmes alone did not flinch. His eyes burned with an interest more intense than surprise, as though a long-suspected theory had suddenly taken human form. Chapter the 4. The Woman from the Crypt. I have seen many strange and disquieting things in the company of Sherlock Holmes, yet seldom one that struck me with such uncanny force as the woman who stood before us in that iron vault. Her features, pale and refined, bore the unmistakable stamp of intellect and suffering. Her dark eyes, though shadowed by exhaustion, met Holmes's unflinching gaze without wavering. The faint light of the fallen lantern glimmered on the damp iron walls, and seemed to play about her as though reluctant to approach too near. "Elena Veris," Holmes repeated softly, as if testing the name upon his tongue. "Of that name I can recall no public mention. Pray enlighten us, madam. What business brings you to this singular house of death?" She drew her cloak about her with a tremor that was not entirely from cold. "You think me a criminal, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice low and clear, "but if I am guilty of anything, it is of knowledge withheld. The device you discovered, that whispering engine, is not mine, though I helped to make it, and because of that folly a man has died." Holmes's expression hardened, though not unkindly. "Then you admit acquaintance with the mechanism?" "I do. Its principles were conceived by my late husband, Dr. Lucien Varis, once of the Royal Society of Engineers. He was a man of great vision and of greater obsession. He believed that sound could do more than merely travel through matter. It could awaken what matter remembered." I must confess that I started. "Awaken?" I echoed. "Surely you speak metaphorically, madam." Her gaze turned to me, earnest and haunted. Perhaps. Yet Lucien did not think so. He maintained that metal, when subjected to constant vibration, retains an echo, a memory of sound once heard. He dreamed of building a device capable of capturing such echoes, not to record as Edison's machine does, but to resurrect them. His first experiments took place here, in the Iron Crypt, when it still belonged to the West India Company. Holmes's voice was cool and even. "And what precisely did he hope to resurrect?" She hesitated, then said simply, "Voices, Mr. Holmes. Voices long dead. He believed that the very walls of this place, having absorbed the sounds of men who worked and perished here, might one day speak again." For a moment silence held sway, a silence deeper than that of the fog above us. Then Holmes spoke in a tone of quiet irony. "An admirable ambition, to make the dead converse. Yet I fear the practical result has proved less poetic. You say he is dead? 3 months ago, An accident, they called it. He was found in this very vault, seated before his instrument, lifeless, as though the sound he sought had answered him too clearly. Her voice faltered. Since that night I have come here at intervals, to see that no one disturbs his work. But I was too late. The apparatus was stolen from its casing, and another constructed from its remains. When I heard that a dockman had died, I knew what had happened, and who must be responsible. Holmes's eyes gleamed. You speak as though you know the culprit. She inclined her head. I do. My husband had a former assistant, a man named Rutherford Gale, an engineer of great skill but unprincipled mind. Lucian dismissed him 2 years ago for theft of designs. I believe Gale has returned, seeking to exploit my husband's invention for his own ends. What ends precisely? I asked. She turned toward me with an intensity that made me involuntarily draw back. Mr. Gale believes the device can do more than carry sound. He believes certain frequencies can influence the human brain, excite terror, obedience, even death. He has learned to weaponize resonance. Holmes regarded her closely. A bold claim, but not impossible. Sound, like light, may exert physical force. Yet why should Gale confine his experiments to a deserted warehouse? Because it is shielded, she replied. The iron walls contain the vibration. No trace escapes into the city. It is, as my husband once said, the perfect tomb for an idea too dangerous to live. Holmes stood silent for a moment, his keen eyes traveling along the riveted walls as though he could see the invisible waves passing through them. And the key? He said abruptly. Who sent me that? I did, she answered. I learned of your work, Mr. Holmes, and of your habit of pursuing what others dismiss as impossible. I feared that if I went openly to the police, they would treat me as a lunatic. So I sent the key, hoping curiosity would draw you here before Gale struck again. Holmes gave a faint, approving nod. A wise stratagem. You have succeeded admirably. Her relief was plain, yet beneath it I sensed a deeper sorrow. But I have come too late, she murmured. Already one man has died, and Gale will not stop. He means to perfect the device. To sell it, perhaps, to those who traffic in war. At this, Holmes's expression changed. A spark of alarm flashed behind the cool grey of his eyes. Watson, he said sharply, do you recall the rusted markings upon the crates within the vault? Yes. Initials, I think. B.D. & Co. Armaments Division. Precisely. Those crates were shipped from Baden in Germany, the same town where the War Office has recently received reports of experimental sonic engines. Gale may already be in correspondence with foreign agents. Then we must stop him, I exclaimed. We shall, said Holmes calmly, but not tonight. He will not return while the vault is occupied, and Miss Varys is exhausted. Come, Watson, we must see her safely away. Eleanor Varys made as if to protest, but Holmes's tone brooked no refusal. Within a few minutes we had escorted her through the misty streets to a lodging house on Narrow Street, where she insisted upon remaining until the following day. Holmes left her with a few quiet instructions and a promise that she would be under his protection. When we reached Baker Street once more, the lamps were burning low, and the city was wrapped in a hush that only the small hours know. Holmes threw off his coat and stood for some time before the fire, his hands clasped behind him, his eyes distant. "You are troubled," said I. "Troubled, yes," he admitted, "because for once I find myself confronting a mind not merely criminal, but scientific, a dangerous combination. This Gale has harnessed knowledge that even physicists scarcely comprehend. If he perfects it, he could strike a man dead without ever touching him, a weapon as silent as thought." He began to pace. Note, too, the symbolism of his choice. The iron crypt, a vault of echoes. It appeals to the theatrical in him. He will not abandon it easily. "Do you believe Miss Varys's account?" I asked. "I do," said Holmes gravely. "Her sincerity is beyond question, and her knowledge too exact to be feigned. Moreover, her husband's name I recall from a paper on acoustic induction delivered to the Royal Society 5 years ago. A visionary but unstable. Precisely the kind of mind that breeds dangerous disciples." He turned suddenly toward me. "Watson, we are dealing with a man who kills with sound. Such an enemy must be met with silence. Tomorrow we return to the docks, but not to the warehouse. I mean to trace the origin of those crates and the trail they conceal." And Miss Ferris? She will be safe for the moment. But if I am not mistaken, he added, glancing toward the window where the fog pressed thick against the glass, the whisper we heard tonight was not the last. The crypt still speaks, and before this case is ended, it will tell us all its secrets, whether we wish to hear them or not. Chapter 5. The Echoes of the Docks. It was a cold, grey morning when Holmes and I set out once more for the East End. A faint drizzle fell from a low and sunless sky, mingling with the smoke from the river steamers, and casting upon all things a damp, metallic sheen. The city seemed half asleep, its life subdued, as if even London herself recoiled from the secrets whispered in her darker quarters. Holmes walked briskly beside me, his head thrust forward, his hands clasped behind his back beneath the folds of his long coat. He had scarcely spoken since breakfast, save to remark upon the varying hue of the river fog as it shifted with the tide, a sign, I knew, that his mind was in its most intense and abstracted state. At last, as we passed beneath the shadow of the Blackwall cranes, he spoke. "Watson," said he, "do you recall the markings upon the iron crates within the vault?" "Perfectly," I replied. "B.D. & Co., Armaments Division." "Just so. I have traced those initials to a firm called Brahm and Dieterling, German manufacturers of industrial components, ostensibly harmless, though certain sources hint at less innocent dealings. A shipment from their Hamburg foundry arrived here under customs seal not 3 weeks ago." "You suspect that Gale's apparatus was constructed from their materials?" "I do, and I further suspect that those materials were not meant for ordinary commerce. Observe, Watson, how the web begins to reveal itself. A stolen design, a secret apparatus, a foreign armament supplier, and a man dead without visible cause. The pattern is one of deliberate purpose. We turned down a narrow lane where the paving stones gleamed like wet iron. The air was heavy with the smell of tar, rope, and brine. Presently we came to a low building of brick and corrugated metal, bearing a weather-worn sign, R. Mulgrave and Sons, Shipping Agents. "This," said Holmes, "is where the Hamburg consignment was received. The elder Mulgrave died some years ago. The business is now run by his son, a man, I am told, of flexible scruples." He rapped smartly upon the office door. After a brief delay, it was opened by a lean, sharp-faced individual with ink-stained fingers and the wary eye of one accustomed to questionable transactions. "Mr. Mulgrave, I presume?" said Holmes, producing a card. "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. We are making certain inquiries regarding a shipment consigned to you last month by the firm of Brahm and Dieterling." The man's expression flickered between caution and curiosity. "What about it, sir?" "Papers were in order. Goods delivered. All proper." "I have no doubt of it," said Holmes smoothly. "Nevertheless, I should be obliged if you would inform me to whom the crates were delivered." Mulgrave hesitated. "Can't say I remember. We handle dozens of consignments. You'll find the entry in the manifest, if it's so important." Holmes smiled, that thin, wintry smile which so often preceded the unravelling of deceit. "Ah, but you do remember, Mr. Mulgrave. You remember very well because the delivery was not made to a registered firm at all. The name entered in your book was false. R. Gale, independent researcher. And since there is no laboratory of that description within the port of London, you were doubtless well paid to overlook the irregularity." The man's lips tightened, but Holmes's gaze held him, as a hawk holds its prey. After a moment, Mulgrave sighed. "I've done no harm," he muttered. "The gentleman gave a proper receipt. Quiet sort. Said he was building an engine for a foreign exhibition." "An engine indeed," murmured Holmes. "Where was it delivered?" Mulgrave glanced toward the window, then back to Holmes. "Warehouse 9, Limehouse Cut. Belongs to a Mr. Fenwick. Been empty for months. Or supposed to be." Holmes inclined his head. "You have been most obliging. I trust you will say nothing of our visit." The man nodded nervously, and we took our leave. As we emerged into the open air once more, Holmes drew a long breath of the river mist as though to clear his mind. "Watson," said he, "I think we have found the lair of our invisible artificer." "Warehouse 9, you mean?" "Precisely. It stands upon the Limehouse Cut, isolated, silent, ideal for experiments that must be concealed. It will not do to force entry by day. Gale will have watchers. Tonight we return, quietly." "You mean to break in?" I asked in surprise. Holmes's eyes twinkled faintly. "Merely to observe. I shall bring a few instruments suited to the purpose. You may bring your revolver, though I hope it will remain unfired." The remainder of the day we passed in Baker Street, where Holmes worked with feverish industry upon certain chemical preparations and adjustments to a curious apparatus of wires, glass tubes, and a small galvanic coil. I watched in fascination as he tested the device by holding it to a tuning fork. A faint hum issued from its base, followed by a delicate tremor of the needle upon his desk. "It is a resonance detector," he explained, seeing my interest. "A crude one, but sufficient. If Gale's machine is indeed active, this will betray its vibrations at a distance. Sound leaves its footprints, Watson. Invisible, but unmistakable." Toward evening, as the city's hum softened into the muffled drone of night, we set forth once more. The streets about Limehouse were almost deserted. Only the glimmer of the river lamps broke the gloom, and the occasional creak of a mooring rope or the splash of oars disturbed the silence. We found Warehouse 9 standing at the end of a narrow wharf, a squat iron-fronted structure with boarded windows and a single door fastened by a heavy padlock. Holmes examined it closely by the light of a shaded lantern. "Unusually new," he murmured. "And see here, the lock bears no mark of wear. Installed recently, Gale is cautious." Producing a set of small tools, he bent over the mechanism. Within moments it yielded silently. We stepped inside. The interior was vast and dark, smelling of rust and stale oil. Holmes moved ahead with the sure-footed ease of a cat. His lantern shuddered to a pin of light. Presently we came upon a series of wooden crates, identical to those we had seen beneath the warehouse. Holmes examined one, then another. "All empty," he said softly. "The contents removed." At that moment his resonance detector gave a faint tremor. The needle quivered, then steadied. "He is near," Holmes whispered. "Not here, perhaps, but within a few 100 yards. Listen." From somewhere beyond the far wall came a sound, faint, rhythmic, metallic. It was like the beating of a distant heart, yet irregular, as though pulsing through the iron itself. I felt a strange unease creep over me, the hairs rising at the nape of my neck. Holmes crouched, his ear close to the floor. "There is a sub-basement," he said. "Old drainage tunnels, perhaps. He is below us." Before I could reply, there came the faint scrape of a footstep from behind. We turned sharply. A figure had entered the doorway, tall, gaunt, the lantern light glinting on a pale, angular face and cold eyes that caught the light like steel. "Mr. Holmes," said the man in a low voice, "you intrude where you do not belong." "Mr. Rutherford Gale, I presume," said Holmes quietly. The man smiled, a thin, mirthless smile. "Your reputation precedes you. You seek knowledge, as do I. But I warn you, curiosity may be fatal." His hand moved toward a switch upon the wall. Holmes sprang forward with a cry. "Watson, down!" A piercing vibration filled the air, a sound too deep to be heard yet felt in the bones. The lantern glass shattered. The walls seemed to pulse like living flesh. I dropped to my knees, my head swimming, my vision darkening. Through the haze I saw Holmes fling a small metal case toward the switch. There was a spark, a flash, and the sound ceased abruptly. When I staggered to my feet, Gale was gone. Only the echo of his laughter, cold and mechanical, lingered in the vault-like space. Holmes straightened slowly, pale but composed. "He has escaped," he said, his voice hoarse. "But not far. That sound, did you feel it, Watson?" "The vibration struck directly at the heart. Another second and we might have joined his victims." He examined the shattered remains of the wall switch. A portable transmitter. Crude, but deadly. He has achieved it, Watson. The resonance that kills. And now he knows we are upon his track. As we made our way back into the night, the fog swallowed us once more. Holmes paused at the edge of the wharf and gazed into the river's shifting blackness. "This man will not be caught by ordinary means," he said softly. "He moves in silence, and his weapon is silence itself. We must listen, not with ears, but with understanding. For the next time we hear that sound, it may be the last." Chapter 6. The Frequency of Death. The morning following our nocturnal encounter at Limehouse was one of wan light and uneasy calm. The fog, though thinner, still clung to the river like a ghost unwilling to depart. I found Holmes at his chemical table, his dressing gown thrown over his shoulders, and the remains of an untouched breakfast cooling upon the tray beside him. The faint hum of his galvanic coil filled the air, while a series of glass resonators trembled faintly to invisible vibrations. He greeted me with a curt nod, his eyes bright but hollowed by sleepless thought. "Watson," said he without preamble, "our adversary has achieved what physicists of the continent only dream of. He has found the frequency of death." I took my accustomed chair opposite him. "You speak figuratively, I hope." "Not entirely. Every structure, animate or inanimate, has its natural vibration, a note to which it responds. A glass, when struck at the precise pitch, shatters. A bridge may collapse to the rhythm of marching feet. The human body, too, has its resonant frequencies. Gale has found one that acts upon the heart. Good heavens! Consider what occurred last night. The vibration struck through the air, but not through the ears. It was felt, not heard, and its effect was instantaneous upon the cardiac system. A few more seconds, and you and I should have suffered the same fate as poor Barlow, the dockman." I shuddered at the memory. But how can sound or vibration act so directly upon life? Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. "It is a question as old as the Greeks, my dear Watson. For what is life but rhythm? The pulse, the breath, the oscillation of nerve and cell. To disturb that rhythm is to unmake the harmony. And so to kill." He rose abruptly and crossed to his violin, which lay upon the mantel. Drawing the bow across a single string, he produced a low, humming note. The nearest resonator upon his desk began at once to tremble in sympathy. "Observe," said he, "how the unseen vibration awakens its twin. Substitute the human heart for this glass bulb, and you will understand the nature of Gale's weapon." He lowered the violin and regarded me gravely. "This man is no ordinary criminal. He is a scientist without conscience. A Prometheus who would rather see the world burn than surrender his fire." At that moment Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a telegram upon a salver. Holmes tore it open, glanced at the contents, and handed it to me without a word. It read, "From Inspector Lestrade, Scotland Yard Urgent. Second death. Found this morning in Clerkenwell workshop. Apparatus present. Similar to first case. Request your immediate attendance." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Our adversary grows reckless. Come, Watson, this promises to be instructive." Within the hour we were driving through the bustling streets toward Clerkenwell, the city brightening under a pale sun that seemed to struggle against the autumn haze. When we arrived, Lestrade was awaiting us outside a small engineering shop, cordoned off by 2 constables. His lean, sallow face bore an expression of professional triumph, tempered by unease. "Morning, Mr. Holmes. I had a feeling you'd turn up. Looks like your man's struck again, though this time we've got something left to show for it." "Indeed? I trust the victim is identifiable." "A mechanic by the name of Hobb. Worked here nights testing motors. Found dead at his bench when they opened up this morning. No wounds, no poison, no sign of struggle. Just stopped like a clock that's run down." Holmes bent over the body, which lay stretched upon a trestle table, its hands still blackened with oil. He examined the face with that cold, pitiless precision that always seemed to exclude emotion. "Yes," he murmured. "The same cyanotic hue, the same dilation of the pupils. Death by sudden cardiac arrest. You have noted the smell, Lestrade? The inspector sniffed cautiously. Ozone, is it? Thought it might be the machinery. Not machinery. Electricity, said Holmes. Our friend Gale employs current to amplify his resonant waves. See here. He pointed to a compact device of metal and glass upon the workbench. The same pattern of coils we saw at Limehouse, though smaller. He is refining his design. Lestrade gave a low whistle. You mean to tell me this contraption killed the man? Indirectly, said Holmes. It emitted the vibration that did. Note the fine dust upon the wires, iron filings. The field was focused through a magnetic lens. Ingenious, almost elegant. He straightened suddenly. Watson, do you perceive the significance? I confess that I did not. Then let me make it plain. Gale's first device required a full chamber of iron to contain and reflect its wave. This one does not. He has succeeded in miniaturizing his weapon. That means he can carry it, perhaps even conceal it upon his person. Lestrade stared. You mean he could kill a man in broad daylight in the middle of the street? Precisely, and with no more sound than the whisper of a tuning fork. The inspector swore softly. Then heaven help us all. Holmes bent once more over the bench, his long fingers hovering delicately above the coils. He has left traces of his own, nevertheless. The insulation upon this wire, note the peculiar varnish, is of continental manufacture. I have seen its like only in German telegraphy. Gale has foreign suppliers still. And the victim? I asked. Was he connected with Gale? Indirectly, said Lestrade. He used to work at the docks. Same district as that dead dockman of yours. Rumor is he took night jobs repairing engines for extra pay. Maybe he saw something he shouldn't. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Or perhaps he was helping Gale. Observe the wiring pattern. It was arranged by an experienced hand. No mere laborer could have achieved such precision. You think Gale killed his own assistant? Holmes's voice was quiet. I think Gale eliminates those who might expose him, and each death marks a step forward in his design. He turned to Lestrade. I must request that you allow me to remove this apparatus for examination. Handle it with the utmost care. A single false contact may prove fatal. Lestrade nodded reluctantly. If it'll help you catch the devil, take it. We returned to Baker Street with the device carefully packed within a wooden case. Holmes set it upon his laboratory table as though it were a relic of some infernal altar. For several hours he worked in complete silence, making measurements, sketching circuits, and comparing frequencies upon a small tuning instrument. I contented myself with watching, though more than once the faint hum of the wires set my nerves on edge. At length Holmes stepped back, his face pale with exhaustion, but lit by fierce exultation. Watson, said he, the principle is clear at last. Gale's device operates between 40 and 50 vibrations per second, a range that induces resonance within the human thorax. The effect depends upon proximity and duration. Death within 5 yards is instantaneous, beyond that merely disabling. He paused, then added grimly, if this knowledge were to fall into the wrong hands, it would make the rifle and the cannon as obsolete as the catapult. Imagine, armies that kill with silence. I could only shake my head. And what do you intend to do? To stop him before he perfects it. Gale must be close to his final prototype, one portable, efficient and deadly. He cannot work alone. There must be a financier, perhaps a buyer, urging him onward. He began to pace. Lestrade's clue about the workshop suggests that Gale has begun testing in populated districts. His next trial will not be upon an assistant. It will be upon a witness, or upon me. I started. Surely you don't mean... I mean that he will seek to silence the only mind capable of thwarting his own. Therefore we shall oblige him. We shall set the stage, Watson, and he will come. That night, as I retired, I could still hear the faint thrumming of the wires from Holmes's laboratory, like the heartbeat of some monstrous thing struggling to be born. And though the house in Baker Street had never seemed safer, I found myself glancing more than once toward the darkened window, half expecting to see a shadow watching from the street below. Holmes's words echoed in my mind. He kills with silence. And in that silence I fancied I could almost hear the deadly frequency, pulsing somewhere in the unseen air between us. Chapter 7. The Man Who Listened. Twice the night was raw and wind-wrought when Holmes summoned me to Baker Street after supper. The fog lay in a dense pall over the city, curling about lamplight and chimney stacks like living smoke. Holmes, with his long coat drawn tightly and his collar turned high, greeted me with a restless glance. "Watson, the hour has come to speak frankly," he said, closing the door against the draught. "We are engaged in a pursuit of uncommon danger, not one to be undertaken without preparation. I intend to set a trap for Gale, but it must be subtle, for his weapon is stealth, and his mind as cunning as any I have met." I settled into my chair, conscious of a certain tension in his voice that was rare indeed. "And this trap," Holmes tapped his fingers upon the resonator, "we shall make him think that his work is complete, that the device is perfect, and we shall make him believe that a man has heard his whisper, and that his secret is safe." He stood and began to pace. "Our quarry operates upon a principle of secrecy. To capture him we must become secrecy itself. He will move toward us only if we present ourselves as willing witnesses, not as pursuers. We must lure him with our own silence." I frowned. "It sounds like a dangerous game." Holmes smiled faintly. "Danger is the element of all pursuit, Watson, but a pursuit without danger is no pursuit at all." Preparations. The following day was spent in careful arrangement. Holmes contacted Inspector Lestrade at Scotland Yard, who agreed to station discreet men near Limehouse. Holmes himself prepared a false lead, a forged document purporting to be a letter from Bram and Detterling, detailing a new, perfected frequency generator. This he arranged to leave in the custody of a known informant in the East End, ensuring that Gale would hear of it. Holmes's most curious preparation, however, was the construction of a listening device, an instrument designed to detect the faintest of sound waves and to amplify them for our scrutiny. He called it, with a rare flourish of humor, the auditory sentry. It was a curious affair, a network of glass tubes, metal diaphragms, and a fine wire mesh designed to magnify resonance. "This, Watson," said he, "will allow us to hear the whisper before it strikes, and to recognize its precise note." The invitation. By evening, Holmes had arranged for the location of our trap, a small abandoned warehouse near the Limehouse Cut, chosen for its proximity to Gale's last known haunt. Holmes had prepared a cover story that a curious researcher, wishing to study the acoustic phenomena of the iron crypt, would be making a demonstration of his apparatus. This, Holmes calculated, would lure Gale as surely as a moth to flame. When night fell, we made our way toward the wharf. The fog was so thick that we had to walk close together, the lamplight disappearing into the grey like a swallowed memory. Holmes carried with him the auditory sentry and a case of small instruments. He moved with a silent purpose, as though every step brought him closer to some unseen end. At the warehouse we found Lestrade waiting with a small detail of men. Holmes gave him a curt nod and then beckoned me forward. Inside, the air was musty, heavy with rust and the faint salt tang of the river. Holmes set his instruments upon a wooden table near the center, arranging them with the precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation. "We must be patient," he said quietly. "This is a waiting game. Gale will not risk his work unless he is certain of its perfection. We must offer him that certainty." The intruder. We had been waiting for some 2 hours, Holmes watching the entrance like a hawk, when Lestrade signaled softly toward the door. A figure moved within the fog outside, tall, gloved, and cautious. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "He has come," he murmured. The figure entered silently. A hush fell upon the warehouse. Holmes stepped forward, his manner calm but deliberate. "Mr. Gale," he said. Gale started, but recovered quickly, a smile curling about his thin lips. Holmes, I had expected you sooner or later, but I confess surprise at your hospitality. You are welcome to it, sir, said Holmes, and also to our listening. Gale's eyes flickered to the instruments. You tempt me, he said softly, but I am not so easily baited. Holmes inclined his head. We shall see. Pray, do you wish to hear the whisper again? Gale gave a short laugh. Always. At a gesture from Holmes, one of Lestrade's men moved to the side and revealed a device, a crude but familiar cylinder. Holmes gestured to Gale to approach. This is your design, is it not? I invite you to demonstrate it. Gale stepped forward, placing a hand upon the cylinder. There was a faint click, a whispering hum that rose slowly into the air. I stepped forward with the auditory sentry. Instantly the instrument quivered, and the needle oscillated with a ghostly tremor. The hum deepened, becoming almost tangible. Holmes bent toward the device, his face drawn in concentration. Yes, he murmured. The note is exact. 42 vibrations per second. The frequency of death. Gale's voice was low, almost triumphant. Then you understand. This is not a mere experiment. This is power. Holmes's eyes met his steadily. Power to silence, but also power to destroy oneself. The hum rose to a subtle crescendo. Gale's fingers twitched upon the device. A faint vibration passed through the floorboards, making the iron walls of the warehouse pulse like living flesh. Holmes placed his hand upon the table and spoke with deliberate calm. Now, sir, let us see whose silence is the deeper. With that, Holmes gave a small signal to Lestrade. The room was suddenly filled with a sound so faint that it was scarcely perceptible. Yet it was enough. Gale staggered, clutching at his head, a grimace twisting his face. He swayed, his breath caught, and then, without another sound, collapsed upon the floor. Holmes stepped forward and lifted the device from him. The whisper can be heard, Mr. Watson, he said softly, but only if one chooses to listen twice. That night ended with Gale in custody, though Holmes made it plain to Lestrade that the danger was not wholly past. Gale had no doubt accomplices still at work, and the iron crypt remained a secret yet to be fully unlocked. As I followed Holmes back to Baker Street, I thought upon his words, and upon the strange device that lay now beneath our lamplight, still humming with the echo of menace. Holmes spoke quietly, almost to himself, as we passed under the fogged gas lamps. The greatest mysteries are those that speak not once but twice, and this case, Watson, has only begun to whisper its truth. Chapter 7. The Vanishing of Sir Julius Harker. London awoke under a veil of fog the following morning, the sort of pall that seemed to drape itself about the city in mourning. Baker Street, usually bustling even at an early hour, lay silent except for the sound of my own boots upon the pavement. Holmes was already at his window, peering into the pallid light of dawn, a pipe between his teeth and the case containing the mysterious cylinder at his side. The events of the previous night weighed heavily upon me. Harker's confession had left me shaken. That such a creation as the frequency of obedience could exist was a matter that haunted me, more so the knowledge that some man, some organization, possessed it still. And now, with Harker vanished, the danger loomed greater than ever. Holmes did not speak until Lestrade arrived at 11, summoned by my request. The inspector strode briskly into the room, his greatcoat damp with fog, his manner brusque. "Morning, gentlemen," he said without preamble. "I've got bad news. Sir Julius Harker is gone. The whole of Scotland Yard's got men out looking for him. No word, no trace. Vanished clean." Holmes inclined his head. "Curious. And where were the ropes he was bound with?" Lestrade glanced about the room. "Gone. We found the window open, of course, but the sill shows no sign of struggle other than the scuffle last night. If he climbed out, he must have had a rope or some device to lower himself unseen. There's nothing in the street. No witnesses." Holmes steepled his fingers. "A disappearance in London. I confess, Lestrade, it is uncommon." "Uncommon? It's the sort of thing that keeps me awake at night," Lestrade grumbled. "But you've still got that music device there. What's your plan for it?" Holmes waved toward the sealed box. We will protect it, Inspector, as one would a dynamite magazine. It is not merely an object, it is a key. And without that key, this entire case remains incomplete. Lestrade grunted. You think Harker's absence is part of some greater design? Holmes gave a faint smile. Lestrade, everything, in this case, is part of a greater design. That is the nature of conspiracies. Once the inspector departed, Holmes turned to me with a gravity that sharpened his voice. Watson, Harker's disappearance changes nothing, but it does sharpen the stakes. He has taken with him knowledge that certain people would kill to obtain. I frowned. But who else would have interest in the sonata? Beyond Harker. Holmes tapped the box gently. That, my dear fellow, is the question. Remember what Harker said, that there were others in Whitehall who wished the matter suppressed. If Harker is their man, he has gone into hiding. If he is not, then we must wonder who waits for him in the shadows. Our deliberations were interrupted by a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a young man of scholarly appearance, with spectacles perched low upon his nose and a notebook in hand. He introduced himself as Mr. Archibald Carroway, a musicologist of some renown, and claimed to have urgent knowledge concerning Linley's sonata. Holmes's eyes glistened with that peculiar mixture of curiosity and caution. Pray, speak, Mr. Carroway. Carroway seated himself, removing his gloves. I have studied the score you recovered, sir, he began, producing a copy of Linley's last manuscript. There is something of great importance here that even Linley himself did not comprehend fully. This sonata is not merely a composition. It is an experiment in acoustic resonance. The final bars are written to produce a vibration so subtle that it can only be perceived by the subconscious. I stared at him, incredulous. Holmes did not interrupt, his eyes fixed on Carroway. The principle is simple, Carroway continued. A series of chords played at a certain frequency can alter neural patterns. Linley discovered this through months of clandestine experimentation. His notes speak of the effect as a form of psychic suggestion. It is in truth a weapon disguised as music. Holmes leaned forward. And you believe Sir Julius Harker intended to deploy it? I have no doubt. I have seen the memorandum of his commission. The government's interest was not in art, but in control. Linley realized this too late. Carroway's voice dropped. Mr. Holmes, I implore you, destroy the sonata before anyone else hears it. If the wrong hands unlock its potential, we will see obedience not through argument, but through compulsion. Holmes sat back, contemplating. I have reason to believe, Mr. Carroway, that the sonata is not yet safe in any man's possession. Sir Julius may have vanished, but the music itself has travelled through that cylinder. It is possible the key to its final form lies within it. And the risk? I asked. Holmes's gaze was fixed upon the sealed case. That the cylinder will be heard by someone with both the will and the means to use it. That is why we must recover Harker, and why we must understand Linley's work. In its entirety. Carroway rose abruptly. Then you will need the aid of the canal. There is something there you have not yet considered. An underwater archive Linley kept beneath the lock at Camden. The truth lies in what the drowned cannot speak. Holmes's expression sharpened. You have my attention. Describe this archive. Carroway hesitated. It is a submerged chamber. A metal vault beneath the water's floor. Linley built it himself, they say, to protect his final work. No one has entered it since his death. Holmes rose at once, brisk as a man possessed. Watson, it appears our next course is clear. We return to Camden tonight, equipped to breach this vault and confront whatever lies within. I glanced at him with unease. After last night, Holmes, are you certain this is wise? He smiled faintly, his eyes glinting. Wisdom, my dear Watson, is a luxury for those who stand aside. We are already in the midst of this symphony. I, for one, intend to hear the final movement. Thus was settled our plan for the evening. Yet I could not shake the sense that we were venturing not merely into water, but into a deeper mystery, one that would test both reason and courage. For I knew, as Holmes knew, that beneath the waters of Camden lay secrets that some men would kill to keep hidden, and the hunt for those secrets was about to begin anew. Chapter the 8th. The Shadow Behind the Whisper. The days following Gale's capture were marked by an uneasy calm in Baker Street, the sort that precedes a storm. Holmes busied himself with the examination of the seized apparatus, and I with my notes, though both of us knew that the affair was far from concluded. Even the lamps in our sitting room seemed dimmed by an unspoken tension, as though the fog of London had seeped inside to linger between us. Holmes rarely spoke before breakfast, yet on that morning he seemed compelled to break silence. He stood beside the window, gazing out upon the street with his habitual intensity. "Watson," he said at last, "the arrest of Rutherford Gale is but one act in a drama yet unfinished. There exists behind him another, a shadow both greater and subtler. I would call him the patron of the whisper." I turned to him in some perplexity. "Patron? His financier," said Holmes crisply. "The man who provides the means and the motive for Gale's dreadful experiments. If we are to end this, we must find him." A thread in the web. Our first step was to consult the evidence gathered by Lestrade. Holmes had arranged that Gale be held under close guard at Bow Street, where his mind might be plucked for truth. Yet the prisoner said little, offering only thin smiles and guarded denials when questioned. Holmes, however, had gleaned enough. Gale's remarks pointed to a meeting place, a private club known only to a small circle of London's wealthier and more curious men. The club was called the Nocturne, a place shrouded in whispers and secrecy, whose members gathered under the pretext of philosophical inquiry. Holmes had learned of it through the subtle questions he had asked of dock workers, port officials, and even a dozing lamplighter. That afternoon he dressed in a manner most calculated to blend with such company, and we set out together. The club was tucked away in a side street near Charing Cross, its entrance marked by a discreet brass plate. Within, the atmosphere was of hushed conversation and scent of cigar smoke. Gas lamps cast a mellow light upon velvet draperies and bookshelves heavy with tomes. Holmes guided us toward a small table in the corner, where he set his hat and coat with deliberate care. "There," he murmured, "is where the shadow sits." I followed his gaze. Across the room sat a man of distinguished appearance, tall, with hair prematurely white, eyes sharp as obsidian, and an air of command that silenced those about him. He conversed quietly with another member, his gestures deliberate and measured. Holmes inclined his head toward me. "That is Victor Deering, one of London's most reclusive magnates, and I suspect the patron." "How do you know?" "By his absence in public affairs until recently, and by the pattern of Gale's purchases. This man's fortune is the veil behind which our adversary hides, and it is no coincidence that his name never appears in connection with the work, except here, in whispers." Holmes rose, signaling to me to follow. We approached the table. "Mr. Deering," said Holmes, with the calm authority that disarms suspicion, "I believe we are acquainted in purpose." The magnate's eyes flickered with recognition. "Mr. Holmes," he said softly, "I have heard of you, but I know not of purpose." Holmes inclined his head. "Then allow me to enlighten you. Your associate, Mr. Gale, is in custody for a crime of singular consequence. That crime is not the theft of design, nor even the death of your assistants, but the invention of a machine capable of extinguishing life by vibration. I have come to ask who stands behind him." Deering's expression hardened. "A scientist's work belongs to science, Mr. Holmes. What he chooses to do with it is beyond my keeping." Holmes's voice grew steelier. "Then you disclaim all knowledge of his purpose, even when it involves a weapon of unprecedented power." The magnate was silent for a long moment, then inclined his head slightly. "I will say only this. Knowledge once discovered cannot be contained. Whether by me or another, it will be used. That is the law of progress." Holmes fixed him with a gaze so intense that Deering faltered. "So be it. But you must understand, sir, that we stand at a crossroads. If Gale completes his device, it will alter the balance of the world, and the shadow you hide behind will be cast forever." Deering leaned back, his composure returning. "You speak as though you are certain to stop him." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "I shall not rest until I have done so." A sudden alarm. Our conversation was cut short by a sudden disturbance outside the club, the sound of hurried footsteps and a muffled cry. Holmes was at the door before I could speak, and I followed him into the narrow corridor beyond. There in the gloom we saw a figure vanishing into the fog. It was a man of slight build, his face obscured by a scarf and hat. Holmes bent to examine the cobblestones. "A message has been delivered," he murmured, "and the sender knew our whereabouts." He returned to the table where Daring had been seated, but the magnate was gone. Only the faint scent of expensive tobacco remained. Holmes's expression was grave. "This confirms it, Watson," he said quietly. "The shadow moves in more than secrecy. It moves in warning. Deering knows we are upon him, and he will act." That evening at Baker Street, Holmes worked late, consulting maps, manifests, and obscure treatises on sound and resonance. He was silent for hours, broken only by the soft scratch of his pen. At last he looked up. "The hour approaches," he said. "Gale's whispers have a source, and that source is the shadow. We must uncover it before the voice becomes a scream." As I lay in my bed that night, I thought upon Holmes's words. Outside the window, London lay in its familiar fog, but I could not shake the sense that beneath it lay a deeper, darker veil, and somewhere, just beyond hearing, the whisper of the iron crypt still waited. Chapter 9. The Web of Silence. The following days were given over to preparation, secrecy, and a certain oppressive waiting. Holmes moved about Baker Street with the quiet energy of a man possessed. He consulted maps of London, lists of warehouses, and old naval charts of the Thames, as though each might conceal a clue. His laboratory table groaned beneath glass tubes and copper coils, his auditory sentry refined to a precision that rivaled a surgeon's scalpel. For my part, I could scarce recall a more tense interval in my years at 2021B. Even Mrs. Hudson remarked upon the change in his manner. "It is a darker sort of case this time, sir," she observed. "You are pale, and your eyes are sharper than usual." Holmes gave no reply except to smile faintly and return to his work. "The darkness, Watson," he said once, "is where the truth hides." The trap is set. By midweek, Holmes had determined the place and moment for our next move. We would lure Gale, and through him his shadow, to the very heart of his own device. The setting would be the old Limehouse-cut warehouse, chosen for its familiarity to our quarry, and the hour would be midnight, when the fog lay thickest, and the night silence deepest. Holmes had arranged with Lestrade to surround the place with constables, invisible to any who approached. We ourselves would enter, ostensibly to study the machinery seized from Gale's workshop, but in truth to tempt the predator into revealing himself. Holmes explained the plan to me one evening with a rare gravity. "Watson, what we weave here is no ordinary net. It is a web of silence, designed to draw the whisper to its source. Once Gale believes himself secure, he will move. Once he moves, we shall have him." He tapped the resonator gently. "The instrument will serve as both lure and sentinel. We shall hear the whisper before it strikes." The evening of the hunt. When the hour arrived, we set forth through the narrow streets toward the cut. The fog was a living thing that night, curling and thickening, muffling sound and swallowing light. The river ran black beneath it, and the lamps along the wharf burned dimly through the gloom. Holmes carried the auditory sentry under his arm. Lestrade's men were posted at agreed points, and I carried my revolver, though I had little hope of its being needed. Holmes spoke scarcely a word as we entered the warehouse, the boards creaking beneath our feet. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of rust and oil. The room was arranged exactly as before, crates stacked in silence, coils of wire lying like sleeping serpents. At the center of it all stood the strange resonator, gleaming in the lamplight. Holmes set his instruments with deliberate care, his hands steady though his face was pale. "Now we wait," he said softly. The whisper. It was close upon midnight when the first sign appeared. A faint vibration passed through the air, so subtle that it seemed almost imagined. Holmes bent to the auditory sentry, his face close to the device. The needle oscillated with a ghostly tremor. "There it is," he murmured. The whisper. It came again, low and constant, a sound not heard but felt, a resonance that seemed to pass beneath the skin and settle in the marrow of the bones. It was as though the night itself were breathing. Holmes glanced toward the entrance. "He is here." From the shadows emerged a figure, tall, gloved, with the gait of a man who moves without haste. His face was half covered, but there was no mistaking his step. Rutherford Gale had returned. "You have invited me," he said softly, "but I wonder whether you truly understand the danger." Holmes replied without hesitation. "We understand enough. You may still speak, Mr. Gale, for there are ears that will listen." Gale's lips curled in something like a smile. "Then you will hear my truth. But first you must endure the whisper." He pressed a small key upon a device at his belt. The air seemed to thicken. The humming rose in intensity, the needle upon Holmes's instrument quivering violently. A subtle vibration passed through the floor. My knees bent instinctively. Holmes, however, stood firm, eyes fixed upon Gale. "It is the frequency of death," he said quietly, "and you will find that I have woven my own counterpoint." With that he struck a small tuning fork upon the table. The note rang out, low, steady, the exact inverse of Gale's. The hum faltered, became discordant, and then ceased entirely. Gale staggered, clutching at his head, his eyes wide with shock. He fell forward, sprawling upon the boards. Holmes stepped quickly to him and pressed the resonator to Gale's device. With a faint click, the apparatus was silent forever. The shadow revealed. As the dust of the moment settled, a figure emerged from behind a row of crates. Daring, the shadow behind Gale, stepped into the lamplight. His face was pale, his eyes cold. "You are clever, Mr. Holmes," he said softly, "but not clever enough." Holmes's gaze was unflinching. "You stand accused of conspiracy to endanger the lives of thousands, Mr. Deering. Your patronage of Gale has placed this city in peril." Deering inclined his head. "Perhaps. But the question remains whether the world should fear what it does not understand, or whether it should bow before progress." Holmes regarded him with quiet disdain. "Progress without conscience is a shadow, and shadows must be brought to light." A constable stepped forward, placing handcuffs upon Daring. His composure did not falter. "You have your conviction, Mr. Holmes, but remember this. The whisper will not die with me." Holmes said nothing, merely pressing his gloved fingers to the resonator and turning toward me. "Watson, we have drawn the web tight, yet I know there are threads still beyond our reach." That night, as London slept beneath its cloak of fog, we left the Limehouse Cut knowing the danger was ended, but also that the mystery of the Iron Crypt was not yet complete. Somewhere in the shadows there remained a whisper that no hand could silence, and in the silence Holmes and I walked homeward, the echo of the night still upon us. Chapter X. The Last Whisper. The dawn following our confrontation at Limehouse Cut rose like a pale promise, veiled in a heavy shroud of fog that seemed to cling to London's very soul. Baker Street was quiet. Even Mrs. Hudson moved through our rooms with the subdued air of one who has witnessed an ordeal. Holmes, however, showed no sign of rest. From early morning until the hour of noon, he remained at his laboratory table, absorbed in the examination of Gale's device and in the careful recording of its properties. I observed him at work, noting with some unease the rare solemnity in his manner. Holmes rarely displayed emotion, and yet there was in his expression now something bordering upon reverence, or perhaps dread. From time to time he would lay aside his tools and glance toward the window, his gaze drawn beyond the street into the veiled city beyond. The morning after, it was over breakfast that Holmes first spoke. "Watson," he said quietly, "I have been examining the mechanism of the whisper, and I have come to a troubling conclusion. There remains one final note, a whisper yet unheard, and its import is grave." I looked up from my tea. "What do you mean?" Holmes leaned forward, fingers interlaced. "The device Gale constructed was incomplete, that we know. But within his notes there lies reference to a principle more terrible still, the iron crypt in its fullest form. It is a structure, a chamber designed to amplify and sustain the whisper indefinitely. Gale's intention was not merely to kill, but to establish an unending vibration, a silent dominion." I drew breath sharply. "That would be a weapon of unimaginable power." "Precisely," said Holmes, "and it is why Dering's patronage was so dangerous. For such a creation could not exist without resources, secrecy, and time. The iron crypt is more than a machine. It is the dream of absolute silence." A new lead Holmes wasted no time. He instructed Lestrade to search certain warehouses along the Thames, focusing upon a set of old naval stores long since abandoned. It was there, Holmes suspected, that Gale's final laboratory might have been erected. By afternoon, the inspector reported nothing of consequence, but Holmes was not discouraged. He turned to me. "Watson, a web is not always visible in daylight. We must listen in darkness." That evening he took the auditory sentry and led me once more toward the river. The fog was thicker than ever, so dense it seemed to obscure the very air. Holmes moved with the assurance of one who hears the world differently than others. We approached a warehouse near Wapping, an edifice of weathered brick and rusted iron. Holmes paused at the threshold, listening. "Do you hear it?" he asked. I did not. Holmes smiled faintly. "Of course you do not. That is why it is a whisper." He produced a tuning fork and set it vibrating. The sound was low and faint, almost imperceptible, yet as the vibration ran through the air, the auditory sentry began to shiver and hum in response. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "We are close," he said. "The shadow returns." Before we could investigate further, footsteps approached. From the fog emerged a figure wrapped in a cloak. It was Dering, his face drawn and pale, his eyes burning with quiet resolve. "You should not be here, Mr. Holmes," he said softly. "And yet we are," replied Holmes. "What is your purpose in these acts, Dering? Why endanger so many for this whisper?" Dering shook his head. "You do not understand. It is not power alone. It is a proof, a testament to human endeavor. Gale sought not murder, but the culmination of art and science. The iron crypt was his opus." Holmes's voice was cold. "A testament built upon death is a blasphemy. There is no honor in such work." Dering's eyes hardened. "Perhaps. But there is truth. The whisper is the language of nature itself. To deny it is to deny discovery." Holmes stepped forward. "And so you would risk the world to hear it?" Dering said nothing. Instead, he turned away and disappeared into the fog. The final confrontation. It was then that Holmes led me into the warehouse. The air within was thick and cold. At its heart lay a structure of iron and glass, half concealed beneath tarpaulins. The true iron crypt. Its walls were latticed with coils and wires, and at its center was a device identical in principle to Gale's, but vast and perfected. Holmes approached it with reverence and caution. "Here lies the last whisper," he murmured. "Here lies the culmination of Gale's vision." He began to examine the machinery, speaking softly to himself. "It is not enough to destroy it. We must understand it. For in understanding lies safety." Suddenly there was a sound, faint at first, then rising into the subtlest of vibrations. The air seemed to shiver. Holmes moved with deliberate swiftness to a control lever. With a deft motion he halted the mechanism. Silence returned, thick and absolute. He turned to me. "It is ended, Watson. The iron crypt will whisper no more." I felt relief, but also a somber weight. Holmes looked at me with a mixture of triumph and warning. "We have prevented catastrophe tonight, but the truth remains. Knowledge without conscience is a peril. The whisper still exists, and there will be those who listen." As we left the warehouse, the fog embraced us once more, and the river ran black beneath its veil. I thought of Dering's parting words and of the strange machinery that now lay silent behind us. Somewhere in London, perhaps, the whisper still lingered. Holmes walked beside me in silence, his mind already turning to the next problem, as ever. For him, the case was closed. But for me, the shadow of the Iron Crypt would whisper for years to come. Chapter 5. Reflections in the Fog. The night after our dismantling of the Iron Crypt was unlike any I had yet spent in Baker Street. London lay beneath a mantle of fog so dense it seemed as though the city had folded in upon itself. From my window, the gas lamps on the street below shone like dim stars struggling through a veil of silver smoke. The hush of the night seemed heavier than usual, and I found my thoughts returning again and again to the events of the preceding hours. Holmes, as I learned, shared my sense of unease. He remained at his table until a late hour, absorbed in the examination of the fragments of Gale's machinery, making notes in his meticulous hand. Occasionally he would pause, gaze out the window, and let a long silence pass between us. When at last he spoke, his voice was low and deliberate. "Watson, the case is not ended. It is merely folded into memory, a memory that may awaken again." I looked at him. "But we have destroyed the machine, Holmes. Gale is in custody. Dering is gone. Surely the danger is past." Holmes shook his head. "Danger is never past so long as men listen without question. The whisper still exists, not in that machine, but in the minds of those who would wield it. Dering was but a patron of the principle. There will be others." A case without closure. We spent the following day in consultation with Inspector Lestrade, who came to Baker Street bearing news of Gale's formal charge and Dering's disappearance. Lestrade reported that the warehouses we had searched were emptied, their contents removed under cover of night. The investigation would continue, he said, but without the evidence Holmes had obtained, the case could easily slip into obscurity. Holmes listened quietly, then turned to me. "This is why I prefer a case to be examined in full, Watson, rather than allowed to rest on partial understanding. For the mind of the criminal is like the fog itself, never wholly seen, but always felt." I nodded, pondering his words. "And what of the whisper? Will it trouble us again?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "I do not know, but I suspect that its echo will persist as long as there is curiosity, and that the shadow behind it will never be entirely banished." A walk in the fog. That evening Holmes proposed a walk through the streets of London. We wrapped ourselves against the cold and ventured forth, our footsteps muffled upon the pavement. The city seemed transformed, the familiar streets rendered strange and secret by the veil of fog. There was no sound except the drip of water from roofs, the distant clop of horses' hooves, and the faint susurration of unseen voices. Holmes spoke rarely, but when he did, it was with the quiet deliberation of a man reflecting upon truths larger than the matter before him. "There is a lesson in this case, Watson," he said. "It is that knowledge is a double-edged sword. It may illuminate, but it may also destroy, and the deeper the silence, the louder the danger." We passed beneath a solitary gas lamp, and I saw the shadow of Holmes stretch long upon the pavement. He glanced at me, a faint smile breaking his habitual reserve. "Your narration of this affair will serve not merely as record, but as warning. The whisper must be heard, but with caution." I was silent, for I felt the truth of his words. The case of the Iron Crypt was not a matter of mere crime, but of philosophy, of the perilous boundary between discovery and destruction. A last conversation. Returning to Baker Street, we found Mrs. Hudson waiting with the evening tea, her eyes concerned. Holmes seated himself in his armchair, and I took mine beside him. We drank our tea in silence for a time, the hush between us deepened by the knowledge that we had approached the end of this tale. At last Holmes spoke. "Watson, I believe this case will rest with us for many years, not as a crime solved, but as a mystery endured. The whisper has been stilled for now, but its lesson remains." I nodded. "And what is your final judgment, Holmes?" He steepled his fingers, his gaze distant. "That the measure of a man lies not merely in what he knows, but in how he listens. And the greatest danger lies in listening without understanding." I was moved by the gravity of his words. Outside the window the fog lay deep upon London, as though the city itself held its breath. And in that silence I thought I heard once again the faint echo of a whisper, a reminder that the mystery was never wholly over. Chapter 2: The Final Summons. The morning following our walk in the fog found Baker Street subdued, as though the events of the previous days had drained it of color. Holmes, as was his custom when deep in thought, remained silent for most of the morning, occupied with his papers and instruments. I, for my part, made my own careful notes, for I knew we approached the close of this most singular case. It was shortly after midday that Holmes announced without preamble that he had received what he called the summons. "A summons, Watson, not from the courts nor Scotland Yard, but from something far more direct," he said, setting aside his pen. His eyes were fixed upon the fire, though his voice carried a sharp certainty. I looked at him in some surprise. "You mean a clue?" "More than a clue," he replied. "It is a message, a summons to the very heart of the matter, the final chamber of the iron crypt." The summons arrives. Holmes did not explain further, but the summons arrived in a manner both curious and discreet. It was delivered by a silent messenger, a man who vanished as swiftly as he appeared. The message itself was contained in a small envelope of heavy parchment, sealed with a symbol I had seen before only once, etched upon a brass panel in Gale's workshop, a coiled serpent overlaid upon a lattice of iron. Holmes opened it with deliberate care. The message was brief, composed of a few lines in an unfamiliar cipher, which Holmes deciphered at once. "It is an invitation," he said. "An invitation to the warehouse at midnight. Signed simply, The Shadow." He looked at me with a rare gravity. "Watson, we must answer, for I believe that all threads of this affair lead to that place, and to that hour." The approach. As the hour of midnight drew near, we prepared ourselves for what Holmes termed the last act. Lestrade had agreed to station officers at a distance, hidden but ready. Holmes carried with him the auditory sentry, now refined to its utmost capacity, and a small bundle of tools of his own devising. The walk toward the warehouse was undertaken in silence, the fog thick and trembling about us. Holmes moved with the precision of a man who hears the world in ways beyond common perception. The gas lamps along the way shone dimly, their light swallowed by the drifting mist. At the cut, the warehouse loomed like a spectre of iron and shadow. Its heavy door stood ajar, as though inviting us in. Holmes pressed a finger to his lips and motioned me forward. Inside the crypt within, the air was heavier still, thick with the scent of metal, oil, and something indefinable, a faint vibration that seemed to pass through the bones themselves. Holmes set the auditory sentry upon the table and listened with an intensity that was almost visible. "It is here," he murmured. "The final whisper, and behind it, the shadow." From the darkness emerged a figure cloaked in black, face hidden beneath a mask that gleamed faintly in the gaslight. The figure moved with measured steps, carrying something wrapped in cloth. "Welcome, Mr. Holmes." "Dr. Watson," the voice said, low and calm. "You have come as I expected." Holmes's voice was steady. "You call yourself the Shadow. You are the author of this design. Why bring us here?" The figure inclined its head. "To end it, or to begin it anew. The choice lies with you." Holmes stepped forward. We choose to end it. The figure unwrapped the object it carried, a tuning device of intricate design pulsing with a faint light. This, said the shadow, is the heart of the iron crypt. It will continue its work until destroyed. Holmes took the device in gloved hands, examining it with care. And it will be destroyed, he said quietly. He signaled to Lestrade's men, and in an instant they surrounded the figure. Holmes set the device upon the table and, with a deft motion, disassembled it entirely. The light ceased, the vibration stilled, and an unnatural silence fell upon the warehouse. The shadow revealed. The figure removed its mask, revealing the face of Victor Dering. His expression was calm, almost serene, as though he had long anticipated this moment. "You have won, Mr. Holmes," he said softly. "But remember, the whisper is eternal. It is not in the machine, but in the minds of men who will build such things again." Holmes regarded him without reply. "You have tested the limits of conscience, Mr. Dering, and found them wanting." Lestrade stepped forward and took Dering into custody. Holmes turned to me, placing a hand upon my shoulder. "Come, Watson. We have reached the final summons, but I fear this case will remain a whisper in the corridors of London for many years to come." As we emerged into the fog, the city lay in an almost unnatural stillness. Even the river seemed hushed. Holmes walked with measured steps, his gaze fixed upon some distant thought. Behind him I followed in silence, knowing that the last chapter of the whisper from the iron crypt had been written, but that its echo would linger far beyond the warehouse walls. Chapter 2. The Final Performance. The council chamber beneath Whitehall seemed charged with some unspoken force. The air was thick with the scent of candle wax and damp stone, the silence deeper than any I had known. Outside, the night pressed on like an unseen tide, as if the city itself awaited the outcome of this clandestine meeting. Holmes stood before the hooded assembly, his posture deliberate, his voice steady. "Gentlemen and ladies," he said, "we have come to the precipice of immoral reckoning. The sonata, as you know, is more than music. It is a key to the will of man. And it is here, before us, that we must decide whether it shall be a tool of dominion or a relic sealed in oblivion." The hooded man, whom I have since learned to be Lord Carroway of the Privy Council, inclined his head. "Mr. Holmes, you have intruded upon matters of state. This council is convened precisely because the sonata's power cannot be left to chance. Yet I concede you have your own claim to oversight. Speak then. How would you propose to resolve this matter?" Holmes's gaze swept the chamber, resting briefly upon each figure in turn. "By destroying it," he said plainly. "The sonata's danger lies not in intent, but in existence. As long as it remains, there will be those who seek to wield it. It is a temptation too great for mortal hands. The only safe course is its utter annihilation." A murmur rose among the council. Carroway spoke again, his voice a low warning. "Destroying it will not erase the knowledge. Others may reconstruct it. You would leave us defenseless against the temptation should it ever return." Holmes's reply was measured. "Then let the knowledge be buried with those who created it. Linley, Harker, they have paid the price. It is not for us to repeat it." Harker stepped forward then, his face pale, his eyes fixed upon Holmes. "You do not understand, sir. I have seen it played. I have heard its measure. It is not merely suggestion. It is command, a voice that speaks to the soul and bends it to will. To destroy it is mercy." A hush followed, broken only by the faint drip of water somewhere in the chamber. Holmes regarded him with a rare expression of sympathy. "And you, sir, have the courage to speak that truth. But courage is not enough. We must act." Lord Carroway's voice was sharp. "Holmes, the sonata is not yours to destroy. It is a matter of national security. If it is destroyed, the Empire loses a power that may one day be essential." Holmes's lips curled slightly. "Power without conscience is perilous, and conscience without power is powerless. But this sonata, is neither conscience nor power. It is a weapon disguised as art." There was a pause, and I knew the moment of decision had come. Holmes stepped toward the pedestal upon which lay the sealed cylinder, placing his hand upon it with deliberate care. "Gentlemen," he said, "I call upon this council to decide whether the sonata shall be preserved or silenced. But I warn you, if it is preserved, this chamber will not be the last place in which it is heard. There will be no sanctuary for those who would misuse it." The hooded assembly conferred in whispers. The candlelight danced across their faces, throwing shadows that seemed to deepen the air's tension. Finally, Lord Carroway spoke. "The council is agreed. The sonata must be destroyed, but not here. It must be taken to a place where no hand may reach it, and no ear may hear it." Holmes inclined his head. "And where would that place be, Lord Carroway?" "The deep," Carroway said simply. "The vault at Camden Lock. It is the only place where the sonata can be hidden from the world beneath water and stone, until such time as its measure is forgotten." Holmes considered this. "It is a fitting requiem, but it must be sealed beyond all reach." There was no further dissent. The council moved with quiet purpose, the members exchanging glances and murmured words. Harker was led aside, silent now, his fate uncertain even to those who brought him here. Carroway produced a small device, an instrument of delicate design, and placed it beside the cylinder. Holmes examined it, his expression grave. "This," Holmes said, "is the final measure. Once the cylinder is placed, the sonata will never again be played. The music will sleep beneath the lock of Camden, and with it the power it holds." I looked at Holmes, my heart heavy. "And if someone finds it again?" Holmes's gaze was steady. "Then they will face the lesson that we teach them now, that some music must never be heard." The council moved then. Holmes and I, with Carroway and Lestrade, followed them to Camden Lock, the path illuminated only by flickering lanterns. The air was heavy with expectation, as though the city itself sensed the import of what was to come. At the lock, the chamber was reopened, the water still and dark. Holmes placed the cylinder upon the pedestal, and Carroway prepared the device to seal it forever. Holmes gave me a look that spoke of resolve. "Watson," he said softly, "we are about to hear the last movement of this case." The device was set in motion. A low hum began beneath the lock, as if the water itself was resonating with the measure of the sonata. The cylinder seemed to shiver in Holmes's hand, a vibration that was almost a whisper. Then, with a faint sigh, the device sealed the box, the metal locking with finality. Holmes stepped back. "It is done. The sonata is no longer a threat. It is a memory buried in stone and water." The council regarded the chamber with solemn silence. Carroway placed his hand upon Holmes's shoulder. "You have done what was necessary, Mr. Holmes." Holmes inclined his head. "We have done what must be done. But, Watson, remember this. There will always be those who seek the music, and the measure of a man is found not in his desire to command, but in his resolve to resist." As we departed Camden Lock, the fog closed about us once more. Somewhere beneath those waters the sonata slept, a drowned measure that would never awaken. But I knew as I walked beside Holmes through the night that this case was not ended. For every mystery we solve, there remains another, and somewhere in the shadows of London there were still whispers of a music that could bend the will of men. Holmes's voice broke my thoughts. "Come, Watson. We have heard the final movement, but the symphony plays on." And so we returned to Baker Street, the fog swallowing our footsteps, leaving behind the silent echo of the drowned pianist's last and most terrible composition. Chapter 3. The Closing Deduction. The following morning was grey and damp, the sort of morning London seems to favour after nights of revelation and trial. At 221B the atmosphere was heavy, as though the case itself still hung between us, unclosed. Holmes was at his table before the fire, turning over fragments of wire and brass recovered from the iron crypt. I watched him in silence, knowing that he was preparing to deliver the summation of this most extraordinary affair. At length he spoke without looking up. "Watson, this case will be remembered for more than its crime. It will stand as an example of the peril inherent in human curiosity unchecked by conscience." I stirred my tea, awaiting the detail of his reasoning. Holmes's summation. Holmes rose, moving to the window and looking out toward the fog-shrouded street. "The matter began with a whisper, a sound so slight that few would take heed. But the whisper was no accident. It was the signature of deliberate design, a calling card of one who wished to see human limits tested. Gale was the craftsman, Deering was the patron, and the iron crypt was their ultimate proof." He turned to face me, his expression grave. "The case has tested more than our skill, Watson. It has tested the boundaries of knowledge itself. For the danger of the whisper lies not in the device alone, but in the principle it embodies. The power to control life by unseen force. Once such power exists, the question of morality is no longer academic." I leaned forward, troubled. "And Deering, what drove him to this end?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Pride, Watson, and the longing to surpass nature. He called it discovery, but it was conquest. Deering's ambition was the forging of a new dominion, one in which man could silence the world itself." The method and the missteps. Holmes returned to his seat, folding his hands. "The path to this conclusion was not plain. There were misdirections aplenty, false leads laid by Gale himself, perhaps to protect his patron, perhaps to disguise his own motives. Our first suspect was a diversion. The break-ins and disappearances were part of a larger pattern, a net woven to conceal the true design. He took from his desk a map of London, marked with notes and routes. The most telling clue lay in the very silence of our quarry. The absence of noise, the careful concealment of his work, spoke louder than any confession. That is the art of the whisper, Watson. To move without sound, to hide in plain hearing." I nodded in admiration. "And the final confrontation? The moment at the cut?" Holmes smiled faintly. "That was the moment we offered the whisper itself its reckoning. The tuning fork was the counter to the call. The trap was not merely of steel and cord, but of sound itself." A broader reflection. Holmes stood and began pacing the room, as was his custom when delivering conclusions. "This case offers a caution. There will always be those who seek the whisper, and those who are willing to pay the price to hear it. The lesson for us, and for London, is that vigilance must outlast victory. For knowledge once glimpsed cannot be unlearned." He paused, resting his gaze upon me. "Watson, you will record this case not only for the sake of justice, but for the sake of warning. The whisper is eternal. It lies in invention, in ambition, and in the silence between men." I understood then that Holmes regarded this as more than a mere case. It was a study of human nature, a meditation upon the perilous edge of discovery. An evening of quiet. That evening Baker Street settled into its usual quiet. Mrs. Hudson moved softly about the rooms, Holmes returned to his violin, and I to my writing. But the case of the whisper from the iron crypt lingered in the air between us. Not in conversation, for Holmes spoke little, but in the silence that followed, charged with the memory of danger and of truth. I set down my pen, realizing that our work was complete. Yet I also knew that the shadow of this case, the shadow behind the whisper, would remain with us for many years to come. Holmes's voice broke the silence. "Watson, the game is never truly over. It merely changes form." I nodded, and he returned to his violin. The notes that followed were low and haunting, as though he played for the whisper itself, bidding it farewell. Chapter 14. Epilogue. The Whisper's End. The days that followed the capture of Victor Deering were filled with the measured hum of official business. Scotland Yard filed its reports, Lestrade completed his statements, and the courts prepared for what would surely become a case of lasting notoriety. At Baker Street, however, life returned slowly to something resembling normalcy. though the memory of the iron crypt and its whisper lingered in both our minds. Holmes was quieter than usual, absorbed in his experiments and occasionally at his violin. For my part, I began the task of compiling the record of the affair, knowing full well that the truth of it lay not merely in fact but in the preservation of atmosphere. The fog, the shadow, and the whisper. A reflection by the fire. One evening, as rain tapped softly upon the windows of our sitting room, Holmes spoke to me of the case in a tone both reflective and final. "Watson," he said, "there comes a moment in every investigation when the truth is revealed, and with it the necessity of closure. We have reached that moment. Yet I suspect that the whisper will never entirely fade." I stirred my tea, watching the firelight play upon his features. "Do you believe it will return?" I asked. Holmes considered me in silence before replying. "It will return, as all human ambition returns. But whether it comes again as creation or destruction rests upon those who listen. That is the question that the ring left unanswered." The quiet after the storm. The city itself seemed to acquiesce to Holmes's words. London, in its eternal fog, settled back into its rhythms. The streets resumed their murmur, the river glistened with muted reflections of gas lamps, and the whisper, if it still existed, was lost among the sounds of ordinary life. Yet for me the case lingered in memory. The echo of the iron crypt seemed to reside in a quiet corner of my mind, a reminder that danger often lies not in what we hear, but in what we fail to hear. A final conversation. One evening I joined Holmes in the small sitting room at Baker Street. He was seated with his violin at rest, the auditory sentry beside him, now silent and dismantled. "You have written the case well, Watson," he said without turning toward me. "But there is something that should be recorded beyond fact and deduction. A warning." "And what is that, Holmes?" I asked. "That the pursuit of knowledge without conscience is the most dangerous game of all. The whisper exists wherever curiosity surpasses caution, and that is a danger not confined to machines or to criminals, but to the mind of man itself." I bowed my head, knowing that Holmes had given me the final lesson of the case. The end of the case. The matter of the whisper from the iron crypt passed soon into the annals of Scotland Yard, recorded as a strange and perilous experiment, its authors brought to justice or lost to the fog. To the world it was closed, but to Holmes and myself, the case remained a singular study of the balance between discovery and restraint. We had walked through shadow and sound, and in the end found silence. That silence, Watson realized, was not merely the absence of noise, but the presence of something infinitely deeper, the quiet that follows truth. And thus the case ended, not with a clatter of revelation, but with the soft fading of a whisper.